Picture this. It's November 18th, 2014, and Buffalo, New York wakes up like any other autumn Tuesday. The air is crisp, the sky is grey, the kind of grey that Buffalonians have known their whole lives. People shuffle into diners for coffee, kids wait at bus stops, breath forming small clouds. On the radio, weather anchors mention a lake-effect snow event. Not a blizzard, not a disaster, just lake effect. Something the city had survived 100 times before. But within 48 hours, Buffalo would be buried under nearly 7 feet of snow. Not gradually. In concentrated, relentless waves. The city would come to a standstill. Roads would vanish. Cars would be abandoned mid-street. And for a brief, terrifying moment, people would wonder if their city could actually disappear. This is the story of the Buffalo Lake Effect snow siege of 2014, the storm that taught a city it had forgotten how to be afraid. And if you've ever watched our channel before, please subscribe and help us reach our goal of 100,000 subscribers. Your support means everything. Now, let's begin. On the morning of November 18th, Buffalo was already tired of autumn. Winter hadn't officially arrived, but the city felt it coming. That weight in the air, that sense of inevitability. People had lived here their whole lives. Their parents had lived here. Their grandparents too. Buffalo meant snow. Buffalo meant cold. Buffalo meant survival. Maria worked the morning shift at a diner on Main Street. She'd been arriving at 5 a.m. for 17 years, watching the city still asleep beneath the streetlights. On this Tuesday, she noticed the wind picking up a bit, stronger than usual, but there was no panic in it, no urgency. She unlocked the diner, started the coffee, and waited for the regulars. 3 blocks away, James stood in his living room, looking out at Lake Erie. He was a retired teacher, 72, who'd spent his life in Buffalo. His house was a modest 2-story on the south side, a neighborhood of families and working people. His wife, Patricia, had already put on the news. The meteorologists were talking about a lake effect event. James nodded. He'd seen these before. You got some snow. You shoveled. Life went on. At the Buffalo Niagara International Airport, workers checked flights. A few departures were already being delayed or cancelled, but nothing dramatic. The National Weather Service had issued a winter weather advisory, basically a suggestion to be cautious. Not a warning, not an emergency declaration, just a heads up. By mid-morning, people were noticing the snow had begun. Not falling exactly, arriving. The difference is subtle but real. Fall creates a gentle flutter. This was different. The flakes seemed to appear rather than descend. The wind was pulling them sideways, upward sometimes, as though the snow was being manufactured by the sky itself rather than simply released. Traffic was still moving, shops were still open, but there was a buzz, that peculiar electricity that precedes something none of us can quite name yet. By noon, on November 18th, visibility had dropped to a quarter mile, then an eighth. Maria looked out the diner window and couldn't see the street across from her. The world had become white. Not beautifully white. Oppressively white. The kind of whiteness that erases everything else. Schools began calling it. One by one, they announced early dismissals. Parents received the texts and made quick decisions. Pick up kids early, or let them ride the bus. Some chose the bus. They thought they were making a rational choice. By 1 p.m., accumulation was already 8 inches and accelerating, not because the snow was falling harder, though it was, but because the lake effect mechanism had fully engaged. Lake Erie, still relatively warm from the autumn, was being whipped by Arctic air flowing down from Canada. The moisture rose, encountered the cold, and crystallized into snow, continuous snow, snow that refused to pause or relent. The National Weather Service upgraded its advisory to a winter storm warning. Still not an emergency, still almost bureaucratic in tone, but James heard it on the radio in his kitchen and felt something shift. He looked at Patricia. "I'm going to fill the bathtubs," he said, "just in case." By 2 p.m., the roads were already treacherous, not impassable yet, or so people believed. A man named David, who managed a warehouse in South Buffalo, decided to close early and send his staff home. 30 people. He thought he was being careful. He thought they'd make it. The first cars began sliding off Route 190, not crashing violently, just losing their grip. A Chevy Suburban found itself perpendicular to the road, its driver shaken but unhurt. A sedan ahead of it had already been abandoned. By 2:30, there were dozens of vehicles pulled over, some still running, windows fogged, drivers inside waiting for visibility to improve. It never did. At the diner, Maria received a call from her daughter, who worked downtown. "Mum, I'm heading home right now. The office is closing." Maria heard the edge in her daughter's voice. Not panic, worry. Her daughter was smart. Her daughter was being careful. But Buffalo was already becoming something else. By 3 p.m., the snow was falling, and rising and swirling at the rate of 2 inches per hour. Ferocious winds, gusting up to 40 miles per hour, created drifts that were taller than a man. A single intersection might be covered in snow 2 feet deep in one spot, nearly bare in another. The randomness of it made navigation impossible. Power lines began to sag under the weight. In some neighborhoods, the first outages flickered and died like candles. James heard the lights dim at 3:15 p.m. They came back, then dimmed again. He filled every container in the house with water. His fingers moved with purpose now. This wasn't precaution anymore. This was preparation. Nightfall came early, 5:30 p.m., and it was absolute. No ambient light from the city reflected off the clouds. No stars, no moon. Just blackness and the roar of wind that had become deafening. People standing outside described it as a sound with weight, as though the wind itself had become a physical presence, pressing against their bodies. On the roads that were still being traveled, visibility had collapsed completely. People couldn't see the hood of their own car. Drivers reported a kind of vertigo, the sensation of being suspended in white space with no reference point, no way to know if they were moving forward or had stalled. Some pulled over, some kept going, trusting dead reckoning and prayer. David's warehouse crew had made it home, or most of them. One woman, Angela, had left work later than the others. She was driving home when her GPS stopped working. The signal couldn't penetrate the snow. She'd lived in Buffalo her whole life. She thought she knew the way. She thought she could navigate by muscle memory. Within 10 minutes, she was lost. Completely, utterly lost. She pulled into what she thought was a parking lot. It wasn't. It was a driveway. But she didn't realize this until, through the whiteout, she saw a house. Lights on, warm-looking. She sat in her car for maybe 5 minutes, hands shaking. Then she made a decision. She got out. The snow came up to her thighs. The wind nearly knocked her backward. 30 feet, the distance from her car to the front door, felt like a mile. Her legs burned. Her lungs burned from breathing the crystalline cold. When she reached the door and knocked, a woman she'd never met opened it immediately. "Get in," the woman said. No questions, no hesitation. Angela spent that night in a stranger's house, drinking coffee in a living room lit by emergency lanterns, listening to the wind howl outside. She learned the woman's name was Susan. Susan lived alone. Susan had been preparing for this storm all afternoon. She had candles, water, canned food, a battery-powered radio. When Angela knocked, Susan had been almost relieved to have someone to help, relieved to have company in the darkness. Meanwhile, back at his house, James had lost power at 7:15 p.m. The grid was collapsing. Across Buffalo, transformers were failing under snow load. Downtown, sections of the city simply went dark. Neighborhoods lost connection. The cell towers, already overwhelmed with calls and texts, began to fail too. James and Patricia moved to the living room and lit a fire in the fireplace. They'd closed all the interior doors to trap heat. They sat on the couch together, watching the flames, listening to the wind. Patricia had her hand on James's arm. Neither spoke much. There was nothing to say. They were safe. They had shelter. But they both understood that outside, the world had become uninhabitable. By 9 p.m., the snow had accumulated to 5 feet in some areas of the city. The Emergency Operations Center had activated. Governor Andrew Cuomo was being briefed. The National Guard was being placed on standby. This was no longer a snowstorm. This was a disaster event. On the roads still being used, people were in real danger now. A medical resident named Tom had been driving to the hospital where he was supposed to start a 12-hour shift. The hospital had called him. "Don't come," they'd said. "It's too dangerous." But Tom was a young man, raised in Buffalo, and he was committed. He thought he could make it. He thought it would be fine. He made it about 3 miles before his car slid off the road into a ravine. Not far, maybe 8 feet down, but enough that he couldn't reverse out. He sat in the car, engine running, heat on, and waited for someone to find him. His phone had maybe 15% battery. He called 911, but the dispatcher told him help was delayed. All help was delayed. Stay in your vehicle, stay warm, help is coming. It took 40 minutes. A local resident, driving slowly through the snow with a plow, saw the car and stopped. He helped Tom out of the ravine, drove him to the nearest shelter, an open church basement, and didn't ask for anything in return. By midnight, the snow had still not stopped. In the morning, November 19th, people woke to a city they didn't recognize. Buffalo had been erased or redesigned. Entire vehicles were buried, only their roofs visible. Houses had snow halfway up their second-story windows. Streets had disappeared into white. The official measurement at the airport would eventually be 53 inches in 18 hours, but in pockets of the city the accumulation topped 6 feet, even 7. And yet something remarkable was already happening. Maria, who hadn't made it home that first night, spent it at the diner with a dozen other people who'd sought shelter there. A neighbor of Maria's had seen the lights on and knocked on the door around 10 p.m. "Can I come in?" he'd asked. Maria had said yes immediately. By morning, there were 15 people in the diner, sleeping on chairs and booths, wrapped in whatever blankets Maria had found in the back. They remember the breakfast she made: eggs, toast, coffee, cooked on a camp stove when the power had died. They remember that no one had money on them for a meal, but Maria had cooked anyway. They remember her telling them, "You're going to need your strength." Down the street, a small neighborhood bar called O'Reilly's had turned itself into a supply depot. The owner, a man named Patrick, had opened his doors to anyone passing through. People arriving soaked in snow were given hot drinks. People asking for directions were given maps and advice. Patrick had a generator in the back. He'd never used it before, and he'd fired it up to power lights and heat. The bar became a kind of refuge, a place where strangers became neighbors. Across the city, church basements flooded with people. Volunteers arrived to help, though arriving anywhere was nearly impossible. They came on foot, dragging sleds with blankets and food. They came in four-wheel-drive vehicles, slowly, carefully, picking up anyone stranded. They came because this was what you did. This was Buffalo. James and Patricia heard on their battery-powered radio that the city had issued an emergency travel ban. No unnecessary movement. Stay home. Wait. By November 19th morning, they were low on food, but they were warm and they were together. A neighbor, someone James had never spoken to before, had shown up at their door with bread and milk from her own supplies. "Just in case you need it," she'd said. The woman's name was Dorothy. She was 78, lived 2 houses down, and had decided that checking on her neighbors was more important than shelter-in-place orders. Dorothy spent 2 hours that morning moving through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, offering supplies, asking if anyone needed help. She was doing this at 78 years old in a blizzard because she'd lived in Buffalo long enough to know that this was the contract. You took care of each other. Angela, still at Susan's house, learned that her car had been buried overnight. She wouldn't find it for 3 days. But by then, she and Susan had become friends. They'd talked for hours about life, about family, about the peculiar intimacy that emerges when 2 strangers are trapped in a house together during a disaster. When Angela finally left, they exchanged numbers. They meant it. The city dug out slowly. By November 20th, main roads were being plowed. By November 21st, the travel ban was lifted. Life began to resume a shape that resembled normal. But something had shifted. People remember that moment, that 48-hour period when the city stopped, when systems failed, when neighbors became essential, not because they wanted to be heroes, because there was no alternative. This was survival, and survival required strangers to become neighbors. Preparedness changed after 2014. Sales of generators spiked, supplies of road salt were stockpiled more carefully. Weather forecasts were followed with genuine attention rather than casual interest. But more than that, people understood something: that the systems they relied on were fragile, that convenience could evaporate in 48 hours, that the person living next door might save your life. In the years after the Buffalo Lake Effect snow siege of 2014, residents kept photographs, images of the buried city, the abandoned cars, the snow that seemed impossible. Angela still has a Christmas card from Susan in her desk drawer. They don't see each other often, but when winter comes, they text, just to check in. James and Patricia never forgot the sound of that wind, the feeling of sitting by firelight while the world whited out around them. They started a neighborhood group that year, just neighbors meeting monthly to discuss emergency preparedness. The group still meets. It's small, but it's consistent. The storm itself wasn't just about snow. It wasn't just about weather systems and atmospheric conditions and lake effect mechanisms. It was about a city remembering what it meant to be vulnerable, to need each other, to sit in a stranger's living room, or in a church basement, or in a diner lit by a camp stove, and discover that connection matters more than we usually admit. Buffalo had been through hard times before: Rust Belt decline, industrial collapse, economic uncertainty. The city knew how to endure. But the 2014 lake effect siege taught it something different. It taught that endurance isn't just personal, it's communal. It's built on the thousand small acts of people showing up for each other when systems fail and only humanity remains. When winter comes to Buffalo now, people are ready. Not just with generators and supplies, though they have those, but with memory, with gratitude, with the understanding that the person next door might be essential and the person across the street might be a friend you haven't met yet. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to support the channel.